Every town has a place where the shadows linger a little longer than they should. But sometimes the darkest places aren't old buildings or forgotten roads. They exist inside people who look just like everyone else. People who smile at neighbors, show up for work, raise families, and shake hands at charity events, all while carrying a secret so monstrous that no one could possibly imagine what is happening behind closed doors. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most chilling cases in American true crime history, the double life of Herbert Richard Baumeister, an Indiana businessman who turned his family estate into a private graveyard and whose crimes were so bizarre, so horrific, and so deeply hidden that even today, investigators are still uncovering the truth. The story truly begins in the summer of 1994, when 33-year-old Roger Goodlett walked out the front door of his mother's home for what should have been a normal night out. He headed toward a bar in downtown Indianapolis, a place he visited often, a place where he felt safe. But Roger never came home, not the next morning, not the next week, not ever. His disappearance wasn't treated with urgency by the police. In the early 90s, missing gay men often weren't. Officers assumed they had left the conservative city for bigger, more accepting places. But Roger's disappearance wasn't an isolated case. For more than a decade, young men, often gay, often in the same age range, often from the same handful of bars, had been vanishing. Some were later found strangled in rural areas outside the city. Others were simply gone. Families whispered, friends worried, and the gay community pleaded for help. But law enforcement dismissed the patterns that were so obvious to everyone else. And somewhere in Indianapolis, a killer was watching this indifference play out and taking full advantage of it. The break in the case came from a man named Tony Harris, a friend of Roger Goodlett, who refused to accept that nothing could be done. Tony told police about a terrifying encounter he had with a man who introduced himself as Brian Smart. Tony had met him at a club, just like Roger had met people before disappearing. Brian was quiet but friendly, well-dressed, and seemingly harmless. He said he was a landscaper from Ohio, working on a vacant property outside Indianapolis. As the night went on, he invited Tony back to that house for drinks and a swim. Tony accepted, but the moment he stepped into the massive, silent property, something felt wrong. Brian led him down into the basement toward an indoor pool, and that was when Tony noticed something that chilled him to the core. Dozens of mannequins posed around the pool. Some were seated on chairs, some reclined as if sunbathing, others positioned like party guests, frozen mid-conversation. When Tony asked about them, Brian simply said, "They keep me company." Tony tried to stay calm, but his instincts were screaming that something was deeply wrong. He refused the drink offered to him, choosing to keep a clear head. Eventually, the situation took a dark turn when Brian suggested they engage in autoerotic asphyxiation. He claimed it was a new trick he enjoyed and insisted it was incredibly satisfying. Tony reluctantly played along, hoping to keep Brian relaxed and predictable. But when it was Tony's turn and Brian wrapped a hose around his neck, the pressure didn't stop. His breathing stalled. His vision dimmed. He realized instantly that this was exactly how Roger and so many others had died. With seconds to spare, Tony made a desperate decision. He went limp and pretended to pass out. The grip loosened immediately. Brian whispered his name, trying to wake him, acting surprised, maybe even disappointed. Somehow, Tony convinced the man to drive him back into the city, outwardly calm but inwardly certain he had just escaped a serial killer. Tony gave police the name Brian Smart, but it led nowhere. The man didn't exist. It wasn't until months later that Tony happened to see him again at a bar. This time, he followed him out and wrote down the license plate number. That plate number led detectives to someone they would never have suspected in a million years. Herbert Richard Baumeister, a 48-year-old married father of 3, owner of 2 successful thrift stores, a man known in the community as odd, yes, but certainly not dangerous. He lived with his wife and children on an 18-acre estate called Fox Hollow Farm, a mansion with 10 bathrooms, a huge indoor pool, a stable, a pond, and enough land that you could scream at the top of your lungs and no neighbor would ever hear it. Nothing about Tony's story seemed to match this suburban businessman, but everything about Herb's life became darker the more the police dug. When investigators first approached Herb's wife, Julie, and asked for permission to search the property, she refused. They didn't have a warrant, and she couldn't imagine her husband being involved in something so horrific. But then a memory surfaced. A day years earlier, when their young son ran inside from the woods holding a human skull. Herb had calmly told the family it was medical waste from his doctor father's old teaching supplies. Julie had accepted that explanation at the time, but now it replayed in her mind with a new, sickening clarity. She also thought about how rarely she and Herb had ever been intimate. In over 20 years of marriage, she could count the number of times on her hands. She thought about his long nights away, the odd behavior, the secretiveness. Something wasn't right. And as their marriage deteriorated in 1996, Julie finally contacted police and gave them permission to search the land while Herb was away. What investigators found at Fox Hollow Farm was beyond anything they were prepared for. Scattered across the wooded acreage were bone fragments, thousands of them, some burned, some crushed, some still partially intact. Forensic teams spent days combing through the soil, and every handful of dirt seemed to reveal another piece of human remains. Ultimately, they recovered more than 10,000 bone fragments belonging to at least 11 individuals, and those were just the ones they could identify. Some remains were so damaged by fire or decay that they may never be matched to a name. These discoveries confirmed what Tony Harris had feared all along. Fox Hollow Farm was a personal burial ground. As detectives unraveled Herb's past, they discovered a long trail of disturbing behavior stretching back to childhood. Herb was fascinated with death from an early age. He collected dead animals and posed their bodies in unnatural positions. He urinated on teachers' desks at school, an act he repeated throughout adulthood at workplaces. His father quietly sent him to psychiatrists, and Herb was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, an antisocial personality disorder, but he never received proper treatment. As an adult, he repressed his sexuality, lived in constant internal conflict, and built a double life where he presented himself as a devoted family man while slipping into the city at night to seek out men at bars. He often drugged them, then strangled them with a hose, the same method he used on Tony, before burning and scattering their remains on his property. Investigators now believe Herb may have murdered as many as 25 men, possibly more. There is also a disturbing possibility that Herb was the mysterious I-70 strangler, a serial killer responsible for at least a dozen murders in the 1980s. The killings from that case abruptly stopped around 1991, the same year Herb purchased Fox Hollow Farm. It's possible that he simply found a more private place to continue the murders. Although never proven, the similarities in victim profiles and methods are too strong to ignore. Once Herb realized police were closing in on him, he fled Indiana and drove to Canada. In July of 1996, at a peaceful lakeside park in Ontario, he wrote a 3-page suicide note. It mentioned stress, financial problems, and marital issues, but not one word about the men he killed, not one acknowledgement of the horrors buried on his land. And then, using a .357 Magnum, he ended his life beneath the trees, leaving far more questions than answers. But the story didn't end with Herb. Even today, investigators continue to examine the land at Fox Hollow Farm. As recently as 2024, new victims have been identified using advanced genetic genealogy. 4 more DNA profiles still remain unmatched, and over 20 areas of the property have been flagged as possible burial sites. More than 10,000 bone fragments have already been recovered, but many believe countless more remain hidden beneath the soil, waiting for someone to find them. The tale of Herb Baumeister is a chilling reminder that monsters rarely look like monsters. Sometimes they are business owners, fathers, neighbors, people who wave from across the yard and seem perfectly normal. The scariest evil, the kind that hides in plain sight, is the kind we never see coming. And in the case of Herb Baumeister, the truth stayed buried for years, until one man trusted his instincts and survived long enough to speak up. If you take anything from this story, let it be this: listen to the voice in your head when something feels wrong.